They wired a psychic god killer into a human mind. She rewired it back. The first thing, Doctor. Elena Marsh noticed about the alien was that it didn't blink. Not ever. Not once in the 47 minutes she'd spent on the other side of the reinforced observation glass, watching it breathe in that slow metronomic rhythm. In for 4 seconds. Out for 8. Like a machine running a program called Life. The creature they'd brought down from the wreckage outside of Reno 3 weeks ago sat in the containment cell with its hands folded in its lap and its pale, lidless eyes fixed on the middle distance between itself and the wall. It wasn't looking at anything. Or maybe it was looking at everything. Elena had not yet figured out which was worse. She uncapped her coffee thermos and drank without tasting it. Behind her, Dr. Warren Finch was talking again. This neurolinguistics team thinks the vocalizations aren't language at all, he said. He was the kind of man who wore a blazer to a containment facility because he'd never quite recovered from wanting people to take him seriously. They think it's something else, closer to music maybe, or mathematics. Patterns encoded in frequency. I know what they think, Elena said. The DoD wants a decision by Friday. I know what the DoD wants. Warren came to stand beside her at the glass. In the reflection, she could see the deep circles under her own eyes. The way her hair had started doing that thing, where it gave up halfway through the day. 38 years old, and she looked like she was running on fumes in spite. Which was accurate. They're going to start the behavioral experiments with or without Yornoff, he said, quieter now. Let them, Elena. Warren. She finally turned and looked at him directly. That thing in there spent 11 days in a sealed cargo container. No food, no water, no light. And when we cracked it open, it was sitting exactly like that. Same position, same expression. It doesn't need to eat, it doesn't need to sleep. It doesn't need anything from us, and it knows it. She looked back through the glass. Whatever it's doing in that head of its, I want to understand it before I let anyone start poking at it. That's not timidity, that's methodology. Warren left without another word. He usually did when she got like this. Elena pressed her palm to the glass and watched the alien breathe. She had a theory, the kind she hadn't written down yet, because written theories became things other people could argue with. The alien, the Vetheri, as the xenolinguistics team had taken to calling them, after picking up what they thought might be a self-referential sound in its vocalizations, didn't communicate through language the way humans did. It didn't need to. The neuroimaging data they'd managed to pull through the non-invasive scanner showed activity patterns in the creature's brain that looked less like cognition and more like signal transmission. Broadband, omnidirectional, like a radio tower that was always broadcasting, which meant it wasn't thinking at you. It was thinking through you. And that, Elena had quietly decided, was the most dangerous thing she had ever encountered in her life. She'd spent 15 years studying human consciousness. Her doctoral thesis had been on the neurochemical substrates of volition, the specific cocktail of proteins and electrochemical gradients that produced the human experience of choosing. Free will biologized and pinned to a board. Her peers had found it either brilliant or reductive, depending on what they'd had for breakfast. What she'd found over a decade and a half of research was that the human brain was not particularly good at being itself. It was excellent at being convinced it was something else. That was the vulnerability. That was what she was afraid of. She made herself leave at 9. The drive back to the residential quarters they'd set up in the repurposed community college, 15 miles from the facility, was long enough that she could think, and short enough that she couldn't resolve anything. She parked, sat in the dark for a while, and then went inside and found the bottle of whiskey she kept behind her field notebooks. She poured 2 fingers and didn't drink it. She just looked at it. The thing she hadn't told Warren, the thing she hadn't told anyone, because it was the kind of information that would get her pulled from the project, was that she thought the Vetheri had already tried to get inside her head once. It had been on day 3. She'd been running the standard visual response tests, holding up colored cards through the transfer slot, noting reaction. Nothing, no response. She'd been reaching in to retrieve the last card when the alien had moved for the first time, just its eyes, tracking to her face. And then something had happened that she could not even now fully describe. It was like static, like the moment before a migraine when the light goes strange. A pressure behind her sternum that had nothing to do with her lungs, and a feeling, brief, almost subliminal, of being perceived so completely that she felt transparent. Then it had looked away, and she had stood there with the colored card in her hand, and her heart slamming against her ribs, and pretended nothing had happened. She picked up the glass and set it down again. Here was what she knew about the Vathery, compiled from 3 weeks of observation, the debriefs of the retrieval team, and the scattered reports from the other 2 contact sites in Montana and Western Canada. They were singular. Not hive-minded in the science fiction sense. They didn't share a group consciousness, but each one was an island of such profound psychic force that the distinction barely mattered. The retrieval team in Montana had lost 4 people, not to violence, to suggestion. The Vathery there had simply persuaded them, at a neurological level they couldn't consciously access, that they didn't need to breathe. 2 of them had been found still alive, barely, 2 had not. The one in the facility 15 miles down the road had not done that yet. Elena was not naive enough to believe it was because it couldn't. She believed it was waiting. She drank the whiskey, after all. Then she opened her notebook and started writing. The first principle of understanding a mind unlike your own, she wrote, is resisting the temptation to assume it wants what you want. The second principle is accepting that it may already understand yours better than you do. The third principle, and this is the one that keeps me awake, the fact that it hasn't acted yet is not evidence of incapacity. It may simply be evidence of patience. She wrote for 2 hours. When she finally slept, she did not dream, which was unusual. She normally dreamed constantly, vivid architectural dreams full of corridors and choices. That night there was nothing, just a clean black. She woke at 5 with the notebook still on her chest, and a certainty, cold and absolute, that she had a decision to make. By 6:30 she was back in the lab. The decision had taken shape somewhere in that dreamless sleep and arrived already formed, the way the best decisions sometimes did. She was going to do something that would end her career if it went wrong, that would terrify every person in the facility if they knew about it. And that was, as far as she could determine, the only move that had any real chance of working. She was going to let it in, not passively, not like the Montana retrieval team, who'd had no defenses and no warning. She was going to do it deliberately, with preparation, with a specific scientific objective, and with a failsafe that she spent the next 4 hours rigging in the containment room, while the morning shift was distracted by a calibration issue in Lab 3 that she had engineered specifically for the purpose. The failsafe was simple. A telemetry beacon on her person, calibrated to her baseline brainwave profile. If her cognition deviated more than 30% from that baseline, if she started showing the flat, directionless surrender pattern that the Montana victims had shown, a signal would go to Warren's terminal and the room would be sealed. They'd lose her, but they wouldn't lose the facility. She thought about leaving a note, decided against it. Notes were for people who weren't coming back. She changed the telemetry beacon batteries twice, checked them, changed them back. She ate half a protein bar she found at the bottom of her bag. She stood outside the containment room door for exactly 1 minute, looking at the handle, and then she opened it and went in. The Vathery did not look up when she entered. Elena pulled the single chair to the center of the room, 6 feet from the alien, which she'd calculated as far enough to not be threatening and close enough to be impossible to ignore, and sat down. She put her hands on her knees, she breathed. "Okay," she said quietly. "Here's the thing. The alien's breathing didn't change. I know you've been in my head. Day 3. The card test." She kept her voice level, clinical, the tone she used when presenting data she wasn't happy about. "I don't know how much you got. I'm guessing not much, because I wasn't expecting it, and I pulled back instinctively, and you let it drop." She paused. "I'm not pulling back now. Nothing. What I need you to understand," she continued, "is that I'm not doing this because I trust you. I don't. I'm doing this because I think we've reached a point where the next thing that happens in this building is either this conversation or something much worse. The people above me are afraid things move fast, and the things afraid people do to things they don't understand tend to be catastrophic and irreversible." She looked directly at those pale, unblinking eyes. "So I'm going to open a door, one door, in the hope that you're intelligent enough to understand what I'm offering and patient enough to use it." She took a long breath and tried to do something she had no biological template for. She consciously, deliberately, and completely stopped defending. It wasn't like relaxing. It was more like dropping a weight she hadn't known she was holding. Something in the architecture of her thoughts, some constant, low-level bracing against outside intrusion that she'd probably been running since day 3, simply went offline. And the silence that replaced it was enormous. The alien moved, not physically. Nothing in the room changed, but Elena felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure. something on the threshold between sensation and perception. Information arriving through a channel she didn't have a name for. It wasn't language. Warren's team had been right about that. It was more like math, or maybe music. A structured thing. Complex in the way that weather is complex, emergent from countless small rules running in parallel. She didn't understand it, but she felt it examining her, not cruelly, not coldly, with something she would later struggle to describe that was closest, in human terms, to the focused attention of a very experienced doctor assessing a patient for the first time. Systematic, thorough, genuinely curious, she sat still and let it look. What it found, what she felt it finding, the strange doubled sensation of being seen and knowing you are being seen, was not what she'd expected. She'd expected it to find her fear, which was real and present. She'd expected it to find her intellect, which was how she usually understood herself. What it seemed most arrested by, what she felt it returning to again and again the way a tongue finds a sore tooth, was something smaller. The whiskey glass, the notebook with the lamp left on, the protein bar at the bottom of the bag, the way she'd checked the batteries twice, the note she'd almost written and then hadn't, the small stub of an irrational refusal to give up, even when giving up would have been the rational choice. The alien made a sound, the first sound it had made in 3 weeks. Low, structured, more felt than heard, the way a cello note feels in your chest before your ears process it. And inside her head, in that strange channel that wasn't quite language, something shifted. Like a door opening, not its thoughts. Not the Vathery's full mind. She understood instinctively that what she was touching was the smallest fraction of a fraction. The way you might dip a finger in the ocean and get a sense of salt without comprehending depth. But a transmission, structured, deliberate, directed specifically at her. It took her 3 days to understand it, and when she did, she sat in the parking lot of the facility and laughed until she cried. What the Vathery had sent her was not a greeting. It was not a threat assessment. It was not even technically communication in any form she'd been prepared for. It was a problem. A single specific problem, encoded in the mathematical musical notation that constituted Vathery thought, given to her the way you might hand someone a locked box. Not to taunt them, but because you'd recognize they were someone who opened things. The problem was about itself, about what the Vathery were. And Elena, sitting in that parking lot with her hands shaking and 3 weeks of sleeplessness behind her, began to understand the shape of why they'd come. They were not, as the DoD had been theorizing, scouts. They were not an advance force. They were not here to assess human military capability or survey resources or establish territorial claim. They were here because they were dying. The Vathery were, by Elena's emerging understanding of the transmission, among the oldest sapient species in explored space. And the oldest sapient species in explored space had, in their long history, encountered a problem that their enormous, powerful, endlessly patient minds had been unable to solve. They had become too good at thinking. The Vathery mind was a masterwork of optimization. Over millions of years of evolution, their cognition had grown so efficient, so finely tuned, so utterly adapted to modeling the universe and predicting outcomes, that they had arrived at a place that no species wants to arrive at. They had eliminated uncertainty, not from the universe, from themselves. A Vathery, who fully engaged their cognitive capacity, could predict, within tolerances that approximated certainty, the outcome of any decision they might make. They could see forward through probability space, with a clarity that made choice effectively meaningless. And a mind for which choice is meaningless is, Elena understood, a mind that is dying. Not biologically, not neurologically, something worse. They were losing the will to continue. Not in any violent, dramatic way. Not depression in the human sense, more like a tide going out. Over generations, the Vathery population had simply been choosing to stop, to let their extraordinary minds go quiet, to cease. Because they had reached the horizon of what thinking could show them, and found that the view, while magnificent, contained no new light. What they'd found in humanity, what had brought 3 of their people to 3 points on a single continent of a small, loud, messy planet, was something they didn't have a word for, but because they had never needed one. Irrationality, not stupidity, not randomness, something else. The specific, biological, stubbornly human capacity to choose something that made no sense, for reasons that defied optimization, in the face of evidence that should have precluded the choice entirely. To leave the note and then decide against it. To check the batteries twice anyway. To sit across from a psychic apex predator in a containment room with a beacon strapped to your chest and 6 minutes of contingency between you and oblivion. Not because the math worked out, but because you'd decided it was the right thing to do, and that turned out to be enough. To the Vethari, this was the most astonishing thing in the known universe. It was also, Elena realized slowly, the thing they had come to ask about, not to take, not to weaponize, to understand. Because understanding it, biochemically, neurologically understanding the mechanism by which a human being generated genuine novelty from within a deterministic system, was the one problem their vast, optimized, beautiful, dying minds had not been able to solve on their own. She went back inside. She went back to the containment room. She sat down in the same chair. She put her hands on her knees. "Okay," she said. "Let's start from the beginning." What followed was not a translation. It was not even in the conventional sense a dialogue. It was something closer to a duet. Two very different instruments trying to find a key they could share, making a mess of it, starting over, making a different mess. Elena spoke aloud because it helped her think, even knowing the alien wasn't processing her words as words. The Vathari transmitted in that mathematical music, and Elena received it the way you receive a dream. Not in sequence, not in language, but in sudden holistic comprehensions that arrived pre-assembled and required unpacking. She learned that the individual in front of her was named in the closest approximation she could manage. Something like seventh in the long consideration. A designation that encoded both identity and role, the way a job title and a name might fuse in a culture where work was self. She started calling it seventh in her notes, and eventually, tentatively, aloud. Seventh did not object. Or, rather, seventh transmitted something that she eventually understood to mean that it found the reduction acceptable, the way a physicist might find a simplified model acceptable. Not accurate, but useful. They talked, and she kept using that word even knowing it was wrong. About the brain. Elena's first, then seventh's, she drew diagrams. She explained the limbic system, the prefrontal cortex, the specific neurochemical cocktail of norepinephrine and dopamine and serotonin that modulated human risk-taking and novelty-seeking. She explained the biology of hope, which turned out to be more interesting to seventh than she'd expected. The fact that humans could genuinely believe in outcomes that the available data did not support. Not through miscalculation, but through a kind of forward-projected emotional commitment that changed their actual behavior. Seventh, in return, showed her, not explained, showed, the distinction mattered, what it felt like to be a mind with no remaining uncertainty. It was not the transmission of a memory or an emotion. It was more like being handed a glass of water, and somehow being able to taste the thirst that the water had failed to quench. She sat with it for a long time after. "You can still feel that something is missing," she said. "That's significant." Seventh's response was the mathematical equivalent of yes, but the resonance beneath it was so weighted with something she could only call sorrow that she had to stop and look at her hands for a moment. "That's actually significant," she said again to her hands. "A mind that knows something is missing is a mind that hasn't fully closed. You're not as optimized as you think you are." She brought Warren in on day 4. Not the whole truth. She didn't tell him about the transmission or the Vathari's purpose, or the extraordinary private grief of a species running out of reasons to continue. She told him she'd established a communication baseline and needed neuroscience support. Warren, to his credit, asked very few questions and assembled a small team. She told the small team even less. She was not being deceptive, or not only being deceptive. She was protecting the transmission because she understood, at an instinctive level that Seventh had perhaps helped calibrate, that there were people in the building whose response to learning that an alien species was here because it found human irrationality inspiring would be to immediately try to figure out how to use it as a weapon. And she needed the weapon people to remain ignorant for a little while longer. 2 more Vathari had by that point arrived at the facility, not in a ship. They were simply there one morning. Outside the perimeter fence, standing in the desert scrub in the pre-dawn gray, not moving, waiting to be let in. The DOD screamed. The base commander screamed louder. Elena walked out to the fence herself, stood on her side of it, and looked at the 2 of them. They were taller than Seventh. Different in the way that individual humans are different. The same fundamental architecture, the same profound stillness, but with variations of posture and proportion that suggested personality, which was interesting. One of them carried something. She couldn't tell what. She called Seventh. Not on a radio. She'd been spending enough time in the transmission that she'd developed something she tentatively classified as a receiving sensitivity. A low-level attunement that she was absolutely not going to document officially, because the psychological evaluation implications were terrifying. She sent the closest thing she could manage to a welcoming thought in Seventh's direction, and waited. Seventh transmitted back, not words, a quality, something she eventually translated as, "They are my." And here the concept didn't have a human equivalent. The closest she could manage was the word family, but larger and older, and carrying a kind of weight that the word family only approaches in extremis, when you haven't seen each other in a very long time. "Let them in," Elena told the base commander. "Dr. Marsh, I need to point out that my authorization does not extend to." "Let them in," she said again. And because something in her voice had changed, in ways she was aware of and slightly unsettled by, he did. They were called, again in approximation, ninth in the long consideration, and third. Third was the elder. The thing third carried was, Elena realized when she got close enough, a data storage medium. Not in any format she recognized. But the intention was clear. They had brought records. She spent 3 days with the records, with Seventh's help, and what she found in them confirmed everything the first transmission had suggested, and complicated it considerably. The Vaetheri had been watching humanity for 260 of their years, roughly 2 human generations. They had been present, in an observatory capacity, through both world wars, through the nuclear age, through the digital revolution and the climate crisis, and every point where human civilization had looked in the mirror and had a serious conversation with itself about whether it deserved to continue. They had watched, and they had found it extraordinary, not the violence, not the politics. The thing they kept returning to in their records, the thing that had eventually compelled them to come down and make contact instead of simply observing, was the recovery. The stubborn, medically irrational, biochemically inexplicable human tendency to go through something catastrophic, and then, after a period of appropriate devastation, decide to try again anyway. They did not have a word for this. They had a mathematical notation for it that Elena eventually translated imperfectly as the persistence coefficient. In their models of intelligence across species, the persistence coefficient was supposed to decrease as cognitive sophistication increased. As a mind became better at predicting outcomes, it should become less likely to attempt things its own models suggested were unlikely to succeed. Humanity's persistence coefficient was not decreasing. It had been by Vaetheri records consistently, bafflingly, high across the entire observation period. And it was not decreasing with increasing access to information technology, which their models had predicted with high confidence would accelerate the rational reassessment of futile efforts. If anything, it was increasing. They had come to ask why. Elena sat with Third's records in the small conference room they'd given her, and she thought about that. She thought about the specific human experience of knowing something is probably not going to work and doing it anyway. The alcoholic who quits for the 14th time. The scientist who resubmits the rejected grant. The parent who gets up at 3 in the morning for the 4th consecutive year and does it with the same love they had at the start. Or something close enough that the difference doesn't matter. The woman who sat down in front of a psychic apex predator with a telemetry beacon and 60 seconds of contingency and said, "Okay, let's start from the beginning." "We don't know why," she told Seventh honestly. "That's the thing you might be missing. We're not irrational because we've worked it out and decided irrationality is optimal. We're irrational because we can't fully see the future. We make choices in incomplete information, and sometimes those choices turn out to be right, and we don't always know which category we're in while we're making them." Seventh processed this for a long time, or what felt like a long time. "The uncertainty," Elena continued, thinking aloud, "isn't a bug. It's the whole machine. A mind that can't be certain can still be surprised, and a mind that can still be surprised is a mind that still has reasons to show up tomorrow." Something happened in the room. It was subtle. Seventh didn't move. The lights didn't change. Nothing she could have described precisely to another person. But she felt it the way you feel a shift in the pressure of a conversation, the moment when something that was tense becomes something that is listening differently. "You came here because you're running out of reasons to show up tomorrow," she said. "And you wanted to understand how we keep making them." She paused. "I think maybe that's the wrong question. I think maybe you don't need to understand it. I think maybe you just need to do it." Seventh made the cello sound. Then Third, across the room, made a different sound. Longer, more complex. And Third transmitted it something that hit Elena like cold water. Not unpleasant, but shocking, in the way that clarity is sometimes shocking. Third was old, she'd understood that, but she hadn't understood how old. Third's designation in the Vathari system, the long consideration part, referred to a specific epoch of ongoing thought, a line of sustained consciousness. Third had been thinking continuously, in the Vathari sense, for what Elena's rough calculation suggested was something close to 4,000 human years. And for the last 600 of those years, Third had been choosing not to stop. Not because Third had any particular faith in the choice, but out of a habit so old it had worn grooves in the fabric of what Third was. A habit. Seventh transmitted the confirmation. The oldest Vathari alive was continuing to exist through nothing more elevated than habit. Through the same irrational, unjustifiable persistence that characterized the species she'd come to study. "Oh," Elena said softly. "Oh, that's something." She looked at the data storage medium from Third's records. She looked at her notebook. She thought about the whiskey glass, and the batteries, and the note she hadn't written. "The thing you've been looking for," she said, "has been happening to you all along. You just called it something else." What followed the realization was less like a breakthrough and more like a slow expansion, a tide coming back in. Over the next 10 days, Elena and Seventh, and eventually Third and Ninth, worked through something that she was careful never to formally call a treatment, because she was a scientist and she had not run the trials, and she was not going to make claims she couldn't substantiate, but which was, functionally, a treatment, an approach, a way of engaging with uncertainty that the Vathari had optimized away and needed to find a path back toward. It was not sophisticated. It was embarrassingly simple. It was, in fact, so simple that when she finally wrote it up, months later, in the most carefully worded paper of her career, reviewed 14 times before submission, several of her peers questioned whether she'd invented it or simply described the obvious. She had described the obvious. That was, she explained in the paper's opening paragraph, rather the point. The approach was this: act on incomplete information. Specifically, choose something where the outcome is genuinely uncertain and commit to it without first running the full predictive analysis. For a Vathari, this was almost physically painful. Their cognition moved toward completion, the way water moves toward a drain. But the pain itself, Elena argued, was the mechanism. The resistance of a still optimizing mind pressing against deliberately incomplete data was precisely the friction that generated the experience of genuine choice. Seventh tried it first. Elena had suggested something manageable. She'd shown Seventh the damaged filtration system in the facility's east wing that two of the engineering staff had been arguing about for weeks. A design question with several plausible solutions but no clear optimal path. She asked Seventh to pick one, not to model it fully, to look at the partial information and then pick. Seventh had gone very still for a long time. Then Seventh had transmitted something. It wasn't a choice about the filtration system. It was about Elena. Specifically, it was about the color of the coffee thermos she'd been carrying since day one. Elena had had it for 11 years. It was dented, and the lid seal was degrading, and it kept her coffee warm for approximately 40 minutes before the heat began bleeding out. She had 3 newer thermoses. She used this one because she'd had it since graduate school, and it had sat on the desk while she wrote her thesis, and there was no rational reason to keep it that she could articulate to another person's satisfaction. Seventh had modeled the thermos extensively, apparently, as part of the early observation, had assessed its functional inferiority, had been, in the Vathari sense, confused by it, but now, attempting to act on incomplete information, to make a choice without full analysis, Seventh understood it, or rather Seventh chose to keep it. In the transmission, what Elena received was not an explanation, but an enactment. The specific cognitive gesture of deciding that something battered and suboptimal and inexplicably important should continue. Applied not to a thermos but to the general project of being alive. It was such a small thing. It was the smallest possible version of the thing. But Elena felt it and had to press her hand flat against the observation table and wait for the moment to pass. "Yeah," she said. "That's it. That's the whole thing." The 3 Vathari stayed for 4 months. In that time, Elena published nothing, disclosed nothing beyond what her carefully worded progress reports required, and aged visibly in ways that the people around her attributed to stress, and that she attributed to the experience of spending extended time in mental contact with a mind 4,000 years old. Warren stopped asking questions. The DoD stopped sending memos, mostly because Elena had developed the specific skill of responding to memos in ways that were technically complete and practically uninformative. On the morning of the day they left, Elena went to the containment area. The containment door was open. The room was empty. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and then she walked to where the chair had been. And she sat on the floor where the chair used to be, because the chair was also gone, and she hadn't noticed. Seventh transmitted once more. Not from the room, from somewhere already outside, already leaving. The transmission was brief and precise, in the mathematical music that she could now receive with something approaching fluency, and it took her a moment to understand it, because it was formatted differently. Not a problem this time, not an inquiry. It was the Vatheri notation for something she eventually translated as, "We will come back." Not as a threat, not even as a promise exactly, as a choice. As a thing chosen, without full knowledge of whether it would be possible, in the way that humans chose things, irreversibly, and with their full self, and without waiting to know how it turned out. She sat on the floor of the empty containment room for a long time. Then she got up, found her coffee thermos, and went back to work. The paper she published 6 months later was titled, "The Persistence Coefficient, a Preliminary Framework for Cross-Species Cognitive Exchange," and it ran to 47 pages, not counting appendices. 3 paragraphs of it described in the most abstract terms her reviewers would allow an encounter with a non-human intelligence. The rest was methodology, data, and the driest possible language she could manage for the argument she was actually making, which was this: the thing that makes human consciousness worth studying is not its complexity, not its language, not its culture or art or mathematics, but its extraordinary, perennial, apparently irreducible willingness to walk into a room where the odds are bad and try the thing anyway. The reviewers called it speculative. Her department chair called it a career risk. The paper received more downloads in its first week than any paper she'd published before. She printed the download count and taped it to the dented thermos and left it on her desk, where it stayed for the rest of the year. In the spring, after the snow cleared from the high desert around the facility, she started having the dreams again, vivid, architectural, full of corridors and choices. In one of them she was in a very large room, bigger than any room she'd been in, and Seventh was there, and Third, and others she didn't recognize. Dozens of them, maybe more, all of them still. All of them breathing in that slow 4-in, 8-out rhythm. But in the dream, every few minutes one of them moved. Just slightly, a head turning, a weight shifting. The small, unremarkable, biologically inexplicable gesture of a being that has decided to be here. She woke from the dream at 3 in the morning, and lay in the dark and listened to the desert wind against the prefab walls, and felt, without knowing why, that something vast and patient had just taken a step. She got up, made coffee in the old thermos, sat at her desk and opened her notebook. She started writing. Outside in the high black sky above the facility, something passed that was not a satellite and not a plane, moving too slow for one and too deliberate for the other. She didn't see it. She was looking at the page. She'd learned a lot, in the past year, about the things that matter, most being the things that happen when you're not looking. The choice made quietly, in the dark, before anyone else is awake. The thing you do not, because you know it will work, but because you've decided to try. She wrote, "Second contact is going to be different. I don't know how, I don't know when, but they said they'd come back, and I believe them, not because the data supports it, but because I saw a 4,000-year-old mind choose something impossible for the first time and find it moved. That's worth writing down." She put the pen down and drank her coffee. The thermos leaked a little, at the seal. She'd been meaning to replace it for years. She set it back on the desk, watched the small, ridiculous rivulet of coffee make its way along the wood grain, put a paper towel under it. Outside, the thing in the sky was gone. She picked up the pen. She kept writing. The second contact happened on a Tuesday, which she later reflected was exactly the kind of detail that made human experience interesting. Not a portentous dawn, not a historical summit with flags and cameras. A Tuesday in November, overcast, smelling of the coming snow, while she was eating a sandwich at her desk and reviewing the revised methodology section of a grant application that was, by her own private assessment, probably not going to be funded. They arrived the same way as before, simply present, without approach, at the perimeter fence. But this time there were 7 of them. Elena heard about it from Warren, who appeared in her office doorway with the expression of a man who has been carrying alarming information at a careful walking pace for the past 10 minutes. 7, she said before he could. 7, he confirmed. How did you? Third is with them. The team thinks. Yes or no? Yes. And there are 4 we haven't seen before. He paused. and they brought something. She was already putting on her jacket. What they'd brought was not this time a data storage medium. It was harder to describe than that. Elena stood at the fence in the November cold and looked at it. A structure about the size of a large suitcase, carried between two of the new Vathari in a way that suggested either extreme care or extreme reverence, or both. It was dark, and slightly luminous at its edges, and it changed shape when she looked at it from different angles, in a way that suggested it was either rotating through a dimension she couldn't fully perceive, or that her visual system simply wasn't calibrated to resolve it correctly. She looked at Seventh. Seventh transmitted. She stood very still for a moment. "What is it?" Warren said, from slightly behind and to her left, which was where he'd been standing since she'd started having the transmissions, because he'd learned instinctively that her attention during transmission was a finite resource that he shouldn't compete for. "It's a gift," Elena said. "What kind of gift?" She looked at the structure again. The light at its edges was the same cold violet blue as Vathari bioluminescence. "The kind where you don't know exactly what to do with it yet," she said. "But you understand that the giving of it is the thing." They let the 7 in. Elena walked with them to the facility, which required a certain amount of creative interaction with the security protocols and the base commander, and, eventually, a phone call to a number in Washington that she'd been told to use only in the event of a development that couldn't be handled on-site. She made the call, and then handed the phone to the base commander, and went to find the conference room with the long table. 7 Vathari in a room built for 12 humans filled it differently than she'd expected. Not physically, they were no larger together than apart, but in the way a room fills with silence when everyone in it is paying complete attention. She sat at the head of the table. Seventh sat. They sat now, she'd noticed, all of them, whereas before they'd simply stood, across from her. Third sat at the far end, the structure between third and ninth, who had returned with the original group. The 4 new ones were, in the transmission he received after a few minutes of orientation, introduced by identifiers that she translated, approximating desperately, as a paired set she eventually called the investigators, and 2 older ones she called the rememberers. The rememberers were, Seventh conveyed, something analogous to historians. They had come specifically because of the paper. Elena had not known the Vathari could access human academic databases. She filed that information for later. "They read the paper?" she said aloud. Seventh transmitted an affirmative. "What did they think of it?" The response that came was long and layered, and she had to work to unpack it. Her fluency, while substantially developed, still had gaps. This way a second language has gaps that only show up in complicated conversations. What she assembled from it was something like this. The rememberers had found the paper consistent with what Third's records contained, but they had also found something in it that the records did not contain, and that something was the paper itself. The existence of a human who had attempted to describe the experience in formal language, who had submitted it to peer review, who had revised it 14 times before deciding it was ready. That process, that specific, absurd, methodologically rigorous, entirely irrational act of trying to make a peer-reviewed case for something that couldn't be proven, had been to the rememberers the most interesting thing in the document.
Not the content, the trying.
Well, Elena said, yes. That's more or less the thesis. The structure on the table hummed, not audibly, in the transmission channel. A kind of resonance that she could feel at the base of her skull, not unpleasant, the way you feel the bass of a large sound system through your sternum before your ears engage. Third spoke, the long, complex vocalization that Elena had last heard the day the first 3 left. And Third transmitted, simultaneously, in a way that was different from the earlier transmissions. Clearer, more structured, as if the months of her own developing fluency had given Third a more precise instrument to use. What Third said, in the closest translation Elena could render, was this: "We have been thinking in the time between. The long consideration has continued, and what we have arrived at, after 4 months of engagement with the problem you gave us, is something we do not have a name for. In our language, a concept that has no name does not yet fully exist. It exists in the approach, in the reaching toward, in the fact that we keep returning to the space where the name should be. We came back because we believe that the name for it exists in yours." Elena sat with that for a moment. "It might not," she said honestly. "We don't name everything we feel. Some things we just feel and then do something about." Third transmitted again. And this time what came through was not the mathematical music Elena had come to associate with Vathari communication. It was something else. Something that used the mathematical structure as scaffolding, but was built of something she didn't have a prior framework for. Richer, more complex, more layered with the kind of meaning that you accumulate over a very long time. She realized, sitting at the head of the conference table with 7 ancient alien minds focused on her, that third was showing her 4,000 years of memory. Not the full 4,000, not the detail, not the sequence, but the texture. The accumulated weight of choosing to continue, day after day, in the Vathari equivalent of days. Long epochs of consciousness sustained through nothing more than the grooves of old decision. And threaded through all of it, in those last 600 years that third had marked as the period of choosing to persist without knowing why. Something that had changed. Something new, not the Vathari finding irrationality. The Vathari discovering, in the act of watching humanity, that they hadn't fully eliminated uncertainty after all. That a mind capable of observing something genuinely new, genuinely foundationally different from any model it had previously run, was a mind that had not yet seen everything. That was the thing that didn't have a Vathari name. The experience of genuine surprise. Not as a statistical anomaly, as a gift. Wonder, Elena said. Seventh's head moved. A small tilt, precise, the first fully voluntary physical gesture she'd seen from a Vathari since the beginning. An attention flicker made physical. It looked, she thought, uncannily, like the gesture of a person who has just heard the word they'd been trying to remember. Wonder, she said again. It's what you feel when something is true and you didn't see it coming. It doesn't actually require the thing to be surprising by objective standards. A person can feel wonder at the same sunset for 50 years. It's a relationship with experience, not an evaluation of it. She spread her hands. It's what makes third keep going, not habit. You misidentified it. It's been wonder this whole time. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind was starting to pick up, the front edge of the storm that had been threatening all morning. Third made a sound she'd never heard before. Short, almost percussive. None of the measured 4/8 breathing rhythm. A sound that had no apparent function except to be made. She thought, for a wild second, that it might be laughter. The structure you brought, she said. What is it? Seventh transmitted. She listened and understood, and then sat with the understanding for long enough that Warren eventually touched her arm gently, and she remembered she was in a room with other people. It's a transmitter, she said. Or it transmits something. It's not for us. She looked at the violet-lit edges of the structure. It's for the others. There were others. She'd known there must be. A species this old and this widespread didn't send 3 individuals to a single planet without reason. The 3 had been the contact team. The 7 were the confirmation. And what the structure would transmit, when it was ready, to whatever receiver the Vathari had distributed through the dark between stars, was, she worked to translate accurately, a notation, an addition to the long records. A new entry in the archive that Third's people maintained across the distances of their long history. The notation described humanity. Specifically, it described the persistence coefficient and the wonder problem and the paper that had been revised 14 times, and the scientist who had walked into a containment room with a beacon on her chest, and the way humans maintain objects past their functional usefulness, because the objects had become part of the ongoing architecture of the self. It described the thermos. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about that. The image of a dented, leaking coffee thermos encoded in alien mathematics and transmitted across interstellar distances to be preserved in a record that was 4,000 years old and showed no signs of stopping. Can I ask you something, she said, not to Seventh, to Third. Third's attention shifted to her. The quality of it was different from Seventh's, older, denser, like the difference between looking at a lake and looking at the ocean. When you've been choosing to continue, she said. All these centuries. The habit, the grooves, the persistence without knowing why. Do you ever get it wrong? Do you ever choose to continue on a day when looking back you wish you'd stopped? Third transmitted. Elena listened. What Third said was, yes, there are such days, there are many of them. The wrongness of certain days is part of the record, preserved alongside the rest, not excised. And then Third transmitted something else. A coda, quieter, that took her longer to unpack. What Third added was, but the days I would have missed trouble me more. Elena nodded. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Outside, the snow started. Quiet and lateral, blowing in across the high desert, filling the silence beyond the building's walls with a white, formless patience that was nothing like the Vathari's stillness, and somehow exactly like it. She reached across the table and wrapped both hands around the old thermos and held it there, warm and ridiculous and specific and entirely hers. "Okay," she said. "Let's figure out the transmitter." They worked through the night, all 9 of them, 7 ancient and 2 exhausted, with Warren eventually producing a truly remarkable number of protein bars from somewhere and distributing them without comment. The investigators turned out to have something close to an engineering orientation, in the Vathery sense, and Elena found she could work with them on the practical questions of the transmitter's interface, in a way that was more direct and technical than her conversations with 7th or 3rd. Less ocean, more lake, she appreciated it. At 4 in the morning she fell asleep briefly in her chair, and woke to find that someone, 9th she thought, based on relative position, had placed her jacket over her shoulders while she slept. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went back to work. The transmission went out at dawn. Not with any particular ceremony, the structure simply shifted, its luminous edges brightening for 30 seconds before dimming to something steadier, and the hum in the transmission channel resolved into something that felt, to Elena, like the moment after a bell has finished ringing. A shaped absence, a made thing. She stood at the window and watched the snow. 7th came to stand beside her. Not in the containment way, not the formal arrangement of the early days, just beside her, and transmitted briefly, something she decoded without effort. It said, "Thank you for opening the door." She thought about that. About the door, and what had been on the other side of it, and what she'd feared, and what she'd found, and what she understood now that she hadn't understood before she went in. "Thank you for being worth it," she said. 7th made the cello sound. The snow kept coming. In the spring, Elena Marsh published a second paper. It was shorter than the first 22 pages, no appendices. It was titled simply, Wonder, which her department chair called unbearably vague, and which received more downloads in its first 48 hours than any paper in the journal's history. The abstract read, "I argue that the most significant contribution of human consciousness to the broader conversation of sapient minds in the universe is not our capacity for language, tool use, or technological development, but our capacity for wonder, defined here as the experience of being genuinely moved by what exists. This is not a soft claim, I intend it precisely. The capacity for wonder, I will demonstrate, is not an aesthetic luxury but a cognitive mechanism, the specific process by which a mind remains open to information that exceeds its current models. It is, in the fullest sense, the engine of continued becoming. Everything else follows from this." She put the pen down. She picked up the thermos. She poured coffee that was already slightly cool, because the seal was going and the heat bled out. She drank it anyway. Outside, the high desert was warming up, the red-brown earth starting to show through the last of the snow. Somewhere out there, in the dark above the warming air, a transmission was moving at the speed of light toward a receiver she would never see, carrying a record of a dented thermos and a decision made in the dark, and a word for something that had been happening for 4,000 years without a name. She had a third paper already forming in her mind. She didn't know what it would say yet. That was, she understood now, the whole point. She kept writing.